Hey, pushers, Mr. Narimatsu here. Coming in with your activity for period 8, the first activity of a very important period that once again covers a lot of ground. What's really cool is last year's class, whether it be AP European history or world history, basically is basically a focus on U.S. Power and U.S. history. So, as we know, at the end of World War II, once again, just like in World War I, United States emerges much stronger, both economically, politically, and also through its military. Most of Europe's military is completely devastated, and they're going to rely basically on the American military and the American economy to kind of get the entire world economy going. And out of the dust kind of emerges another superpower, the Soviet Union as well, Russia, who has a different brand of political and economic power, which is called communism. So that's the kind of what's happening during period 8. Period 8, we're going to be reviewing a lot of focus on foreign policy, which is the Cold War, a fight not be directly between the Soviet Union, the USSR, what we know as Russia today, and the United States and its Western allies, but rather a war in which you're going to use other countries to fight your war, if that makes sense. So if communists arrive on one place of the world, the United States will support the other side of that fight with democratic and capitalist. And we'll talk about the different ways in which they support the different sides in different countries as you guys see examples of these wars, most specifically the Korean and the Vietnam War, which is important to the United States. But this is actually a world war, Cold War. It's between three different worlds. It's between the first world, the United States and their allies, the second world, the Soviet Union and their Soviet states, which are largely in Eastern Europe and spreading through now a little bit of Asia, with specifically in China, North Vietnam, and North Korea, which we'll discuss. And then the third world, which is Latin America, Africa, most of the Middle East, that we're still deciding upon which fights that would happen. And we're not going to be specific into those areas, but Afghanistan had a history between the Soviet Union and the United States. Parts of Latin America, most definitely, Cuba, we'll be talking about in this section, but also in places like Venezuela. There is going to be, in Argentina, excuse me, there's going to be fights between the communists and the capitalists, with the communists kind of orienting themselves to the Soviet side of the world, and Americans kind of, and the Democrats kind of siding themselves to the American view of the world. So we'll get into it. You may not know what the word communist is. You may not understand really what this democracy capitalist fight is. But hopefully by the end of this unit, you guys definitely will. So let's get into the basics here. Let's not go too much further. But I did want to spend some time kind of talking about that. Oh, and then on the other side of period 8 is kind of what's happening inside of our country domestically, right? So education levels are increasing. A lot of turmoil. The 70s and the 60s and 70s are just known for, if you guys know, hippies and a lot of social turmoil. So a lot of our minority movements are going to be birthed out of there. The environmental movement is going to come from these movements. Obviously, civil rights. And Martin Luther King. That is that time, the 60s and the 70s, of really social upheaval. A lot of dramatic social change that very quickly happened in the United States. Which I would say is very dramatically clear to the type of social upheaval we've been experiencing, for the last 5 years here. And I'm recording this in 2021 now, so just to give you an idea of what's going on. So that's kind of what period 8's about: foreign policy, the Cold War, and the Soviet Union, and how America is getting involved in world affairs. We've torn up the farewell address of Washington, and to stay out of entangling alliances and isolationists, and we are fully into it as now a world leader. And we are going to start as a world leader. We're going to be challenged by the Soviet Union for our leadership, and we're going to merge out of the Cold War as leaders. As actually the lone superpower of the world again. And then what's happening domestically. All right, cool. So let's get into it. So as I said, one thing is this is basically a fight called the Cold War. The two sides you guys have is, so that we understand these symbols, is the United States representing democracy, the ability for people to vote in free elections, and also capitalism, the belief that government, and at this time, guys, there is no true capitalism, right? Adam Smith is gone, right? John Maynard Keynes and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, that's the brand of capitalism that almost all supposedly capitalist countries embrace. right? The government is there to do certain things. It is needs to provide services to its people. It does need to provide taxes. It's going to get involved during economic recessions and depressions, and also going to get involved during boom times and good times, to manage the economy. But it's not going to be hands-on as much as the communists will be, where it's just almost state directed. And this is seen today in China. China, just to give you a heads up, there's basically the President Xi Jinping, and he basically makes all of the decisions. And he does talk a little bit to like a small governing board, which is basically 12 officials that are elected by the Communist Party. And you only have one party that you choose for. There's not Democrats, Republicans, it's only communists. So you vote for communist leaders. These communist leaders vote for 12 communist leaders, and that 12 group make basically decisions in coordination with the president making most of the decisions. So it's not a form of democracy; it's a dictatorship, right? And so this communism, this dictatorship, this control of the economy, currently, China is challenging this kind of idea of capitalism here in the United States, because they're kind of doing capitalism, but it's state directed. And what I mean by that is they see maybe, oh my gosh, electric vehicles are important for the world, important everything. We're going to get 20 companies, and our government's going to give money to get those 20 companies to start up. And we have a certain version of that. It'd be called grants or subsidies and or tax cuts, like things we give to businesses to help them grow and prosper, so that we're leaders in the world for a certain product or certain idea or whatever that is. So the fight is going to be between those two, and they're going to grab allies throughout the world. And this is kind of a world war, but it's not a hot war, and that's why I call it a Cold War, because a hot war, by theory, is where you're directly engaging with the other enemy. They're going to use different battlefields, but they're going to use the people in there to create almost like mini civil wars between communism and democratic capitalism. Okay. So that's kind of like the basic tenets of the Cold War, the basic idea of communism and capitalism. Obviously, one kind of resides on more freedom of the people to choose their leaders and also to choose economic decisions, whereas one is a little bit more state directed, not only in its leadership but also the decisions it makes for its economy. And just to speak clearly, communism has failed, right? Just as a heads up, like the communist style, the communist form of economy management was not successful. People were paid incorrectly. There was a lot of corruption. People sometimes were getting paid for not even showing up to work. It really did create some inefficiencies. And so out of this, democracy and capitalism are going to be seen as a strong way to improve one's standard of living, increase ideas, provide toleration, and also increase economic output, which is, I keep on telling you guys as an economic historian, that's one of the most important things for our country to do to make its economy strong. And that's what you're going to see here. The United States is going to get involved to make economy strong so they don't submit themselves to communism. Because desperate people do desperate things and think of desperate things in desperate times, right? And so the goal is, hey, let's not make people do desperate. I mean, Adolf Hitler, the rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler is an example of a desperate group of people, the Germans, at a desperate time due to a lot of economic problems, coming to desperate measures, and, that's why I like history, because it's just like ourselves, people sometimes have to make desperate choices in desperate times due to desperate measures, right? So, all right, so that's going to give you an overview. Another little overview of the Cold War, just to show you guys kind of physically what's going on the map. Remember that the United States, coming out of World War II, had basically come on this side with the Germans, with the French and the English against the Germans. And notice that the Soviet Union was kind of by themselves this way. We're going to talk about this, but World War II, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union is not one of really that they want. It's one of because of Hitler. It's a forced necessity because of a forced evil. Inside of this class, we often talk about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, in this case, the Soviet Union was because of the break off of this Nazi-Soviet pact when Hitler actually invaded the Soviet Union and basically broke off a peace treaty. That's when they came in. If you look at Russian history, the United States and its allies actually funded the group and try to help get the whites to win in their civil war. And right now, the people in power, Stalin and the Bolsheviks and the former Bolsheviks are actually the Reds. So, Stalin's kind of looking at these guys and go, remember, 20 years ago, you guys tried to almost fund the white army to kill all me and my friends in the Red Army. So there's already been a history that communism and democracy and capitalism are not going to work. And so there's suspicions during World War II of each other. Always, there's always suspicions between these two groups, and because of that, once World War II ends and the common enemy called Hitler and Nazi Germany is eradicated, these suspicions rise up again, right? We're going to see these things come in. First, they had a kind of agreed upon goal. Now that the goal is done, what's going to happen? And you're going to see these guys try to check each other, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Um, so yeah, just remember that World War II again. This uneasy alliance. I thought that was a really cool map, by the way. I mean, cool picture of the images, but just kind of give you a physical understanding of what's going on, right? So we had the well, what's happening, but I guess I wanted to point this out. Just say that these guys were allies, right? They all worked together, but it was again an uneasy alliance. So at the end of World War II, we have a devastated Europe. It's been blown up. Its economy is in ruins. We already know the story of what happens when there's an economy in ruins is that people get desperate, and this kind of brought up Hitler. So the big three, which is the three most important allies, going back over here, you might go, well, what happened to France? France was largely invaded by Nazi Germany. Half of it was actually almost all of it actually was under control of it, and there were groups of people kind of fighting like underground, what we call guerrilla tactics against the Nazis that were like pro-French guys. So yeah, they're in there, but this country really wasn't even put together right now. The actual government was controlled by Nazi Germany. So that's why the three individuals is going to be Stalin, Churchill, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they meet. So here's Churchill, Stalin, and FDR. They meet in Yalta, and they meet in many different places at the end of World War II. And this is before like World War II even ends, but they know they're going to win, and they're trying to figure out when this ends, what's going to happen. And what's more important for us to understand in this article is in Yalta they agree on what we're going to do with Germany. And the French obviously have been concerned about Germany for a while, and now the Soviets are as well, right? So we have two allies, and probably the British too, because in the battle of like London and Blitzkrieg, they got just hammered. London got devastated after World War II. Almost everything in London got destroyed except for like a church, St. Peter's Basilica. So with that being said, they come to agreement in Yalta that says that this is in German, so I apologize for that. But anyways, that this is going to be the British zone, this is going to be the French zone, the American zone, and this is going to be the Soviet zone. And what ultimately will happen, let's just go and tell a story now, is that the Soviets don't really hold elections into this zone. They kind of go back on it, and we're going to show that happen time and time again. And they kind of just put in pro-Soviet people. People are going to listen to Russia. And then this group kind of created like their own country, kind of united it, and it becomes West Germany, which is with friends with the Americans and the British and capitalists and democracy versus this communism, then dictatorship that's happening over here in East Germany. And so there's actually going to be like a division. And then within Berlin, it's divided as well. And this is where we're going to get something famous called the Berlin Wall that's going to separate East Germany, again, which will be under Soviet control, with West Germany. And you're like, wow, looks like West Germany is all by itself. I mean, West Berlin is all by itself. And we're going to talk about that. We're actually going to fly things over this zone and drop things off to help them out to make sure that they're taken care of. So out of this mutual suspicion arises a guy called George F. Kennan, and he basically says what we need to do is kind of like contain this, and that kind of becomes part of the Truman Doctrine as well. How do we stop the Soviet Union spread? How do we stop them from influencing elections and just taking countries over? Because we're not so okay with this whole dictatorship thing, you know. So George Kennan comes in and says what we need to do is contain it, right? So like it says, forest policy containing, like, hey, we're not going to go engage with them. We're not going to go into a place where they've already been and try to put them back and shove them back to the Soviet Union. What we are going to do, though, is help all of the countries there and kind of make sure that communism and the idea of communism doesn't spread. And quite honestly, the people that go under communist rule at the very beginning from the Soviet Union that are major in Eastern Europe don't like it, right? It is a total control and the loss of freedoms. And in many cases, it was a total control of their economic part. So like restaurants, family restaurants. I remember I went to Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Austria, and they talked about like, especially in like Budapest, in Hungary, they talked about the fact that like family restaurants had been there for years, suddenly were taken over by the government, and now all the money you had to make had to go back to the government, right? That was the brand of communism. So you're going to see this, that multiple people, when they get into this communist rule, it's not this like perfect little paradise where everybody's getting paid perfectly amounts. It's not. It's a much more extreme and harsher environment, and people are actually running towards the West, running towards West Germany, running towards France, running towards Great Britain, trying to get out of these places as communists begin to go ahead and take it over. So as a heads up, that's kind of what's happening. This kind of example, I just want to show you guys of these areas. These areas basically were promised after World War II to have free elections. The Soviets, if they do have free elections, they're rigged, right? They're like they're only Soviets that are allowed to go ahead and be on the ballot, right? And people are kind of concerned anyway. So the free elections of Eastern Europe don't really happen. Here's another example, Stalin coming in and just grabbing things, right? And just putting little things over, right? The free elections that he had promised to in the Yalta conference don't happen. And again, this just increases this mutual suspicion, especially by the Americans, the British, that, Russia wants to take over the entire world, almost like what Nazi Germany did, right? So again, a little starting to get concerning. So under this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies at the very end of World War II, and Truman actually comes in. The European War is almost done when FDR dies, but we have a few more months of the Japanese, the war with Japan, and he uses this is the president that actually signs to authorize the 2 nuclear weapons that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So during this time, this Cold War is developing, and so he definitely believes in the containment theory. And how he believes he should contain them is not just simply just like trying to put troops on there, but really actually trying to help the governments and countries. So we're going to help them financially. We're going to send advisors over there to tell them how to maybe run their military, run their economy, run their government, so things are efficient, so things are better, so their people feel that democracy and capitalism is a much better system, and it did. It worked well. So they did this through the assistance of U.S. money and U.S. loans and U.S. support and U.S. military equipment or military training. And that is what Truman doctrine is, and that's what's going to be used during the Cold War. It's a idea of containment, and the way in which you contain is you build walls of great countries that will stop this, because they will not invade. Well, they won't invade because there's an agreement between all the countries, and we'll talk about that in a second, that if Russia does attack one of these countries that have all these allies, that all of the allies will then attack them. So it kind of turned into this what we call mutually assured destruction experience, where there's so many people on one side and so many people on the other side, and they have all allies. Kind of sounds like World War II. That if something did go down, it would go down pretty hard, and that's why this does become a Cold War. And also you bring in nuclear weapons into it, where if somebody actually uses hits a couple buttons, and we got nuclear warheads coming over, you have the total humanity's done, right? Like nuclear holocaust, as they said it. So there's a lot of reasons why Truman, the Americans, and the Soviets are always concerned about getting too close to each other to actually hit each other, right? And so the Truman doctrine is the idea, okay, let's not even hit them. Let's just make sure the countries that surround them are so strong they'll never be infiltrated by communists. They won't have that. We'll be allies with them, and we'll work with them. And that's the same thing the Soviets do, right? This is what the Soviets do in this map, right? These are all countries that are going to be working together in Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany. So they're pretty much doing very similar things. I have this map here too, because they talk about this is the way in which the Truman Doctrine is actually used. So they create something called the Marshall Plan. So again, at this time, all of these countries have been devastated by World War II. And since all these countries have chosen to be part of the American democracy capitalism side, they got American money. And so this kind of shows the amount of American support and money that they each individually received. France receiving a lot, Great Britain receiving a lot. Italy, which was an Axis, right, was under a total regime, but the people actually, prior to the end of World War II, actually go in the street and revolt against him and actually execute him in Italian streets. So the country kind of turns very much democratic capitalist from its totalitarian history of Mussolini. But anyways, these are kind of the individual amounts, and you can see what this represents is money, supplies, advisors. I don't know what exactly represents, to tell you the truth, but those are the type of things, that they were sending to these areas specifically to stop communism coming in, another way to contain them. Okay. Coming back to Berlin, I kind of talked about this, but just as a reminder, remember that Berlin got actually separated into zones too, and then a wall gets created, right? And so East Berlin, again, the Soviets, and then West, right? So that's something to remember in Europe. We'll talk about Asia. There's a North and South thing, but in Europe, if you're East, you're most likely under Soviet control. If you're West and you're part of what we call Western Europe, or you have what we call Western values, the west you go, you're probably more allied to the United States, Great Britain, and America. And this is where we get that term, the West, as well. By the way, is this division that happened in the Cold War? The West being more democratic, usually has Bill of Rights, freedoms, freedom of speech, and the other side being a little more totalitarian, dictatorships, control the economy and the political system as well. So out of this comes the Berlin airlift, because what the obvious Soviets did is they didn't allow any of the supplies to go into Berlin here. They actually wanted to cut it off and take Berlin all to itself. And so since no supplies are coming in, what we do is we go, fine, we'll just go on the air and drop them off. And that's exactly what we do. So we began dropping off supplies, and this was known as the Berlin airlift. We're dropping off food, we're dropping off gasoline, we're dropping off clothes, anything to keep its economy going and help out the people who are still devastated by war. The German people have been blown up by war. I mean, literally look at this plane that's like driving over, and it's over somebody's home that has just been blown up because of World War II. All right, so that's what's happening during that time in our way to support and contain it. Lastly, a group called NATO comes in. It stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's basically spearheaded by the United States and all of its allies. And this group says an attack by one of them is attack by all. Now, there's a couple. This is the most updated map, so there's some countries like Poland that weren't part of it, and not all of Germany was in there. And what's kind of funny now is there's been a few times Russia, which is what this alliance system was used to make sure that if these guys attack one of these guys, all these guys are going to gang up against Russia. Russia, about like 5-6 years ago, wanted to be into NATO, I think it was, or maybe 10 years ago. It was a while ago, but it's kind of a funny moment in history where like NATO had been created to stop Russia. Now Russia wanted to be part of the NATO thing. So, anyways, these are the countries that are in it. I think, yeah, I think Belgium's in there, so I think that's a Belgian flag. Anyways, so that's it. All right, guys, so that's the kind of beginning of Cold War. I know this is a little bit longer, but I apologize, but it's really important to understand those basic foundations of capitalism and communism, democracy, and totalitarianism, so that you kind of understand why this is such a larger fight. And so there it is. All right, guys, we'll get to the next one. We'll keep on talking about the foreign policy of the United States and kind of where the Cold War leads us. Take care.